Hello folks, this is Leah Wanasaki from Master Lab Systems. Today we'll be looking at serverless GraphQL APIs with AWS AppSync. Well, essentially building scalable serverless GraphQL backends with Dynamo and Lambda resolvers. So we'll be deploying our serverless GraphQL APIs on AWS AppSync. Okay? So let's look at the objectives for today's learning. Okay, so we'll be creating the DynamoDB table, create the AppSync API, and upload the schema, add the DynamoDB data source, add the resolvers with VLT for creating a new book, getting a book, and returning a list of books, and add Lambda data source for permissions to create such books and resolvers, test the queries in AppSync console and with Postman. And lastly, we'll be deploying using the SAM model, which is known as the serverless application model for deployment or for deploying serverless GraphQL APIs. Okay? So let's look at why GraphQL plus serverless. First, we need to know the advantages of using GraphQL and serverless. So, well, flexible queries, which is, for example, if a client requests something that they require, well, essentially clients usually request only the data they require or the resource they require. AppSync will manage the GraphQL schemas and queries, and it scales those automatically. Serverless, so no servers to provision, which is something known as pay per use. So in this case, using serverless, it essentially means we will not going to be provisioning any server or any VMs for that matter. Everything will just be a pay as per use case, and it is very great for rapid APIs, mobile, web clients, and microservices. Okay. So what is AWS AppSync? AWS AppSync is managed GraphQL service by AWS. So it means that it is a GraphQL, well, not basically a GraphQL, but it's an API which is managed by AWS, which runs on AppSync. However, in this case, we will be looking at GraphQL services, and AWS is mostly targets GraphQL APIs, unlike REST APIs, for example. And integrations like DynamoDB, Lambda, HTTP, RTS, they are all done directly via the data API. And lastly, it supports subscriptions like WebSockets, offline sync, caching, or using the IAM, Cognito, and the API keys for authentication and authorization. Let's look at the two common patterns: direct resolvers to DynamoDB. So those are fast, cheap, and easy. And they use VLT mapping, which is the templates for creating and provisioning API resources and server resources using CloudFormation, which is what we'll be looking at in the minute. Okay, so let's look at Lambda resolvers now. So those are complex for business logic, third-party calls, and aggregations. So Lambda resolvers are different than direct resolvers because, well, direct resolvers will go to DynamoDB, which is a very fast and cheap labor to use, and it's seamlessly easy to integrate with your AWS serverless GraphQL API. While the Lambda resolvers are for complex business logic, for having, for instance, if you have some very complicated business rules or business use cases, and where you might need to get some data from another third-party sources or some third-party API calls. So those are Lambda resolvers, not the direct resolvers. Okay? And those are not as fast and as cheap as the other ones that are directed or that are directly inside the AWS console. Okay? We will be doing a demo for this, which will be creating a GraphQL schema, which is a book application or a book model, to a data source, integrate a Dynamo table, a DynamoDB to create our data for tables or our table data, our books table data, okay, and implement resolvers, which is known as functions or functionalities for our API So those functions will be get book. If you want to get a book by an ID, list all the available books in your application or create a new book. So that will also be done by Dynamo using the VLT. Okay? And implemented advanced resolver via Lambda for a search book function or a search book resolver. So those are endpoints basically. But since GraphQL only contains one endpoint, so it will just be a functionality or something called a resolver. And lastly, we'll be deploying everything to AWS using the SAM, which is known as the Serverless Application Model. Okay, so also, which is very recommended if you haven't set it up, the SAM and AWS CLI, I'd strongly advise to look into my previous tutorials with AWS to do that. Okay, let's look at AppSync versus Lambda, cost and performance. So direct DynamoDB resolvers, they are very low on latency and they're very cheap and they are limited in terms of logic. It means everything has been it's what you can get. It's only something that's inside the AWS ecosystem. So if you want to do now another integrations with third-party sources or get some data from somewhere else, some third-party libraries, third-party APIs, or from third-party data sources, then it would require you to use Lambda resolvers. So let's now look at Lambda resolvers. So Lambda resolvers are more flexible, extra code stack latency, and extra cost per invocation because the roots now are no longer inside the AWS ecosystem. However, they are also now extended to other third-party sources. For example, as I mentioned earlier, if you would want to get some data from a third-party API, third-party application, or a third-party data source or somewhere else, that is no longer now a direct Dynamo resolver, but a Lambda resolver, which is of course not as cheaper as it would be if you were to use the direct Lambda resolver or a direct DynamoDB resolver. Again, choose based on complexity of requirements operations, of course. So to choose on which one you want to use, so again, it depends on your use case and your requirements for your application. Okay, so let's now look at the security and auth. So auth options for direct DynamoDB resolvers or direct Lambda resolvers would mean everything such as authentication is done on AWS side, such as API key using the IAM rules and the IAM incognito or the OIDC, which is something a mechanism for also doing the security and authentication. So for production use, of course, you might want to use Cognito or IAM, which is the identity and manager and management. For fine-grained IAM for resolvers, which is for fine-grained security resolvers. Okay, use role-based data access on resolvers to and secure Lambda IAM roles. So using role-based also it means you it's like allowing certain users to access certain resources based on their security or based on what you want them to access. So of course, using Lambda IAM role will be your best choice to do that. Okay, which we'll also be looking at. So let's look at the CI/CD and deployment pipeline. Of course, using AWS CTK CloudFormation, which is now in this case we'll be using CloudFormation to do the deployment, and in conjunction with the SAM. As I said, SAM, it stands for Serverless Application Model. It's also for deployment, like a build tool for deploying applications on AWS Serverless using CloudFormation and in conjunction with SAM. Also, you can use GitHub Actions or Code Pipeline to deploy schema or functions, or use AppSync to push to AWS Amplify, CLR, or deploy. So folks, before looking at the QA and the next steps, I would strongly like us to create this repo. Oh, lastly, before I forgot, let's look at the project structure that we require for this demo. So our project should contain something like a template. So a template, it's what will be holding all the CloudFormation configuration, all our DB config, resolvers, such as our API endpoints, API schemas, and our security for IAM roles, to provision those IAM roles and to do the deployment using the SAM. Okay, and then we will have now something called the SAM config, which is that one. It's automatically generated by the SAM. As soon as you set up SAM, or you install the SAM, which is the serverless application model, which is that CLI for it. As soon as you install that, it will automatically generate the SAM terminal, the terminal file for configuration. So looking at the search function is just basically gonna be a React or a JavaScript project which will contain two files, mainly the index.js, that will be a Lambda handler to initiate the Lambda functions, and then secondly it will be a package.json, which will just be our package file that contains our AWS CTK that we will require for handling that Lambda handler. And then lastly, of course, don't necessarily need it, which is the README for the project. Okay, so folks, what I will be using now in this case, maybe I'm just gonna first show you how you want to do this on AWS side first before going to the CLI or to my terminal, so we can start doing this deployment and testing of this GraphQL API on serverless or on AppSync. Okay, so maybe if you have been logged into AWS first, you might want to look at how AWS looks like. So of course, going to AWS, maybe you might want to say AWS, or maybe if I can just close out mine, I can just close this current tab and create a new one. So if I come in here, for example, okay, let's go to my cloud. Okay, cloud. If we go to AWS console, maybe let's just use one of my I bookmarked. Okay, so of course in your startup, this is probably what you will be seeing. You'll probably see the console home, of course. So maybe let me also start on the console home so you can get a better understanding of what I will be doing. Okay, so very important, this is the default page when you've successfully logged into AWS on the free account. So very important to be sure that you are on your origin, which is in this case I'm looking for the US East one. That's the region I wanna be, because that's where I wanna interact with. Okay, so now what we need what? We require Dynamo, because of we will be creating an API that will be reading and writing data from our data storage, which is DynamoDB in this case. We require CloudFormation, that will a tool for provisioning our resources, our API keys, and our IAM roles for the AWS AppSync. So we require that too. So for now, I will be showing you, which is, of course, my current old deployments. So for DynamoDB, let's go to tables. We shouldn't show anything currently, which is fine, exactly what we want. So as you can see, there's 0 tables. So now, lastly, let's go to AppSync. We also don't want to see any API here right now, since we'll be creating a new one from scratch and testing that one. So as you can see, no APIs. So there are no any existing APIs. Okay. So now we can begin to go to our console and create this application. Okay. So a new stack should be created here. We should be able to see it here once we create it on the terminal side. So first of all, what you need, you have to ensure that you can authenticate to AWS on your console, which is what I will be showing you now. And also make sure that you have a SAM installed, which is the serverless application model. It should be installed in your application, in your terminal as well. So, and you can get the link to the installation of it. I think I probably have it here. Okay, yes, install SAM. So using this link to install SAM depending on your platform you are using. But of course, if you are not sure, you can ping me or you can write in a comment or look at my previous AWS setup that will contain all of this content or all of this information, and how you can set up your own, how you can set up your own AWS CLI on your console or on your terminal or on your machine locally. Okay, so once you have that installed, for example, now I'm using Linux version, I'm using Linux OSR here. So if I do a sum version dash version, so I should be getting my sum version in, meaning my sum is already successfully installed. Okay, as you can see, folks, my sum is installed. So now we can begin creating what? This application. Okay. So what I will do now is to be sure that I'm on the same directory. So okay, with AWS. Right. So now if I do now sudo -s mkdir AppSync. Okay, let me just get the name again. I just want to use the name, which is the AppSync demo. Okay, if we do that, mkdir AppSync demo, oh, that's fine. Okay, do that. Okay, so now we have the AppSync demo in. So now inside that we require now, which is the search function. Okay, so inside it, let's do now cd to AppSync demo, so which is also empty. So inside that we need to make another directory, mkdir, which is search function, like that. Okay, fine. Now we have the search function as well. Okay, and then from here I'm just going to open this in my IDE, then we can start editing our files. Okay, so just going to bring out my VS Code. Okay, so now just open up the folder. We need to open the folder. Okay, AWS AppSync demo. I open this in here. Okay, which is now what we should be seeing. Okay, currently it's empty. So the first file we need, which should be directly in the default file, which is going to be the template.yml. So let's have that in here, template.yml. So as I said, the template.yml file is going to be our configuration file for CloudFormation stack. That will be responsible for provisioning our infrastructure, DB tables, API keys, IAM roles, and granting our API itself. Okay, so now that we have the template in, let's move on now to this search function. So here we need what? The index.js, which is going to be responsible for handling our Lambda function. Okay, so now since it's a JavaScript project, it requires to have what? Some dependencies, package.json, which should contain our CTK, AWS CTK dependency. Okay, so I have some basic snippets for those, so which you should be seeing them. Okay, so the dependency file, just gonna copy that in. So on the package.json, this is what we need. So as you can see, project name, search function, it's fine, and the version is going to version 1, and the main file it's invoking, it's going to call the and to unpack the dependency that is going to be used inside that Lambda function. Okay, so dependency will require only AWS SDK, so that's fine. I will save that in. Okay, and then now we can begin to add our Lambda. Okay, maybe before even adding our Lambda, let's ensure that we can get this file. Okay, so we have the template.yml file, which is fine, and also inside the search we should see the two files exactly, which is the index.js and the package.json. Okay, so now I'm just gonna be on the same path as the other side as well to ensure that we can sync. Yes, I will also be using the screen. Okay, maybe just reset it. Okay, just do it clear. So do LR. Okay, fine. Both aligned now. So from here, what we require again now. So now that we have all of these files in place, so let's also again add our Lambda function. Okay, I'm just gonna copy that. Of course, I'll explain the code. So just to copy that, so this Lambda function, it's just gonna be interacting with our API in returning the books when we need them. Okay, so it's basically just of course const AWS, which requires what? The CTK library that we need to be installing. Then it goes to AWS Dynamo to a document. It creates the initiator table called books table, and then it does that, which is it delivers the arguments based on the arguments payload. And then from that, it does a simple scan and filter for, but of course, to return our items back if we need them. So basically, just this basic Lambda function that just interacts with our AWS and returns our items when we need them. So now that we have this in here now, so what I will be doing now, I need to install this Lambda function. So of course I need to be in that path, which you need to do cd search function, do LR. So to install this, because it needs to be installed first, so I will do npm install. So npm install, since this is a node project, let's first install it. Okay, it will probably take some time. So once we are done installing it, then we will then begin to add our VTL template, which is our CloudFormation template, to provision our infrastructure and also create our code resolvers, so our book resolvers. Okay, so let's just give it a second while it's doing the install. Okay, so that seems to have installed success. Okay, so we can verify that by going again to our ITN. Exactly, so we should see now the package log file. Okay, so that seems fine. I'll close this and close this. So now let's add our template. So I will explain this template exactly now. We should also, since we didn't install, of course it will auto generate the node modules for us. Okay, so now let's look at it now, which is now the templates.yml that we need. I will explain this template because of the syntax for it. It's very sensitive. So it's important that we get it right, start from the top to bottom. So I'll explain to it and ensure how it derived with it. So this is the template. So this template, what it does, it initiates using CloudFormation stack. It initiates what? The GraphQL API. As you can see here, maybe starting from there, of course, we're defining it. Description, we're giving it a description, AppSync GraphQL with DynamoDB, running the description. So now we are specifying the resources that it needs to provision. So it needs to provision what? The AppSync API, which is the API that interacts with DynamoDB to query from the DB. So we require the GraphQL API, which is the resource that you can see. We also require what? The API key, which is the AppSync API key for authenticating to the API on the AppSync APIs or the AppSync GraphQL API. So now from there, we need to create the GraphQL schema to provision our application, which is what we'll be provisioning now, our own API, okay, which is our book API. So now we are defining that GraphQL schema, which is now look at the definition. It takes a parameter of a book, which is an ID of an ID, and a title of a string, and an author of a string. So again, if you don't know how GraphQL works, I can look at also my previous tutorials where I'm explaining how GraphQL works. So for example, now we are defining a type query. So a type query, as I mentioned the last time, so GraphQL works with two ways. We have two types of queries, which is a type query and a type mutation. So a type query, it's only if you want to return something. So, which is in REST APIs, it will be a get if you are trying to get something or list something. So, however, when it comes to type mutation, so mutation queries are like now when you are trying to create something new, or you are updating something that exists on the server, or maybe you are trying to delete something on the server. So that is what we call now in GraphQL a type mutation. Okay, so then schema, we need to call both query. It needs to allow a type query to be executed, which is if we need to return those books, or we need to return a certain book by an item. And we need to also define as part of our schema the mutation query, which is this one, if we need to create a new book. Okay, now we are moving on. Now let's look at the DynamoDB table, that the provisioning of the DynamoDB table. So we're also defining it. Books table, the code goes to that, and then we are assigning some PC attributes, and also the key schema, which is the primary key, so which is that ID. Okay, so we'll also move on. So now let's look at the IAM role for AppSync, which is we require now. So we also need to let our CloudFormation to also automate the provisioning of our IAM roles. So of course we require that, but of course this might be too much. So if you need this repo, I can push it to my GitHub account. Then you can also clone it on the end for testing. So also we are provisioning our resources, policies. We are aligning all of those to ensure that we have the right permissions and the right roles. Okay, so let's look at now the DynamoDB data source. So of course it needs to automate the creation of the book, which is of the book table. That's basically what it's this resource doing. Okay, so now let's look at the resolvers. So resolvers, of course, as I said, resolvers are functions or endpoints for our application, but since this is GraphQL, those are called as resolvers. Okay, so let's look at the create a book resolver, which should create a book. Is I've seen the query, what query will it execute if you were to create a book. So now we need to create it a resolver, which is something that AppSync will understand when it needs to create our GraphQL API. Okay, so we are creating the book resolver now to create a new book. So which is defining it, create a book, and then we are assigning request mapping, and we are also giving it some certain arguments so it knows what it's looking for, and listening for when it's creating the book. Okay. Let's look at now the second resolver, which is the get book resolver. If now we are getting a book by an ID, this is basically what it's looking for. As you can see, the key, it's getting that book by an ID, and the operation is get item. Very important to look at the operation. As you can see here, it was a create, so the operation is put item. That's the operation we are doing. Let's look at the list resolver now, which is the list book resolver, which should list out all our available books in our database using our GraphQL API. So now it should be the operation. If you can see, it's scan, because of this one, just going to scan and it returns that. But the field name on itself, and as you can see, it's what it's returning, what items, not just one single individual items, but it's returning items, meaning a list of our available books. Okay, so let's look at the outputs now. So outputs would be what basically what will require for us if, for example, we were to test outside of AWS environment. So for example, in Postman, so outputs just generate our API URL, API key to authenticate on other systems. For example, if you had a front-end application that should consume this API, using this output, you will be able to authenticate and access your API. But I will show you how this works as well. Okay, so those are just outputs. They give us an ability, or they just returns what the API URL and the API key to authenticate to be able to interact with this GraphQL API. Okay, so now that we got all in, folks, so now we can go back to our terminal to start to do deployment. Okay, so from here, what we need to do now, so the first step, when we have added what a template file, is to do a validation, of course, using CloudFormation to validate in issues like syntax errors, or just some spell checks errors, or some linting issues. So now we need to again be on the same path for what. So now I will do what, switch it back again to be again where on this path that contains this template file. Okay, so now using this command, which is validate, so this command, it says AWS CloudFormation validate -template. We are passing now the template file, which is now calling that template, and in also specifying the region, which is the US East, which is very important. Sometimes if you don't specify the region, AWS will just block your command. So let's just press enter now and try to validate this template against syntax. Okay, everything seems fine. As you can see, it is able to read my description, and it didn't provide any found any errors to that, so it means it's safe for deployment. So now we can do what a deployment. So now that we have this in and it's validated, which is fine, so now we need to do a build first to build this template. So using some build, it will build our template. So and prepares it for a deployment. So let's do now a some build. Okay, as you can see, build succeeded, meaning everything, the template was built successful file. Okay, so now we can do a deploy to deploy this template to AWS. So let's do a deploy some deploy guided, which should do our deployment. Okay, stack name. So I'm just going to call this as this name. Okay. Yes, that's fine. The region. So confirm the changes before deploy. Yes. Let's confirm that. Allow some CLI to create a role permission. Yes, we need that. So this will automatically create and generate a configuration file for some. Okay, disable rollback. We can put it to yes, fine. Save arguments to file, yes. So some config, yes, yes. So that's fine. So now let's give it a second. It will initiate a deployment, as you can see. Now it's initiated the deployment and it's uploading our file, which is finished to upload, if you can see there. So let's look at it now. Let's review this change set before we allow this deployment, or before we initiate this deployment. So it will do what? So it will add the AppSync API. It will add the AppSync API key. It will add the AppSync schema, add the AppSync service role, create a book table, create a book resolver, and create a Dynamo data source, and create a get book resolver, and this list book resolver, which are our basic core functionalities. Okay, let's deploy this change set now. Yes, let's allow it while it's initiating the deployment. Okay. As I said earlier, it's important to verify and validate your template before initiating this deployment, so it is free from errors or syntax issues or any misspell issues you might have. So now let's give it some second while it's initiating this and doing this deploy. Okay, as you can see, folks, the deployment seems to be successful and we are getting our outputs back, which is what I've mentioned. What is an output? Exactly, as you can see, we are getting back our API key, which is what you are seeing here, and this is our URL. And as you can see, it goes to our generated endpoint for GraphQL, which will allow us to interact with this API outside of AWS environment. Even if, for example, you can go to Postman, what we will also be looking at that. But another comment, if you didn't have, for example, or if you didn't provide or specify this output from these outputs from your file, for example, so which is also, I don't really recommend not to specify them, because of you want immediately when you've done a deployment, so you can see the endpoint and the key to access your API. So from here, what I would suggest, if you didn't provide those, there is a command which is to get the stack info. Let me see. Okay, yes, the stack output. So this command will go there. Let's just provide the correct name for our project. Okay, let's get that and paste in. So now we will describe that stack based on that stack name we gave it, which is the AppSync demo, and get our API key, but it should return the same thing. Let's run it and see. As you can see, again, it's returning pretty much the same outputs that we got above. So it means, folks, now we can be able, now for example, now if I were to list here the available tables, we should see the table that we created, which was provisioned from that deployment command. So if, for example, I would say list tables using the AWS DynamoDB list tables.region, so we should list out our book tables. As you can see, folks, we are getting back our books tables. And as well, if we can go to the interface now, we should see that stack that we just created. As you can see, it's already in create complete. So immediately now we are getting it, and we should also see what, there we go, even the description, it's there, AppSync GraphQL demo. So now also, if we can go here, let's try to refresh. it should show our table. As you can see, books table got created and it's active. Same goes for our API. Now let's go now and view now here. Let's do a refresh now because now it should show our API. So let's just do a refresh. As you can see, immediately now we are having one API, which is the AppSync GraphQL, so which is what exactly we just created. Okay, so now folks, it's time for us to test this API. We created the VTLs, created the resolvers, initiated the deployment. Now it's time to test this API. Okay, so now from here, if for instance we click to it, we go to queries. So clicking into queries opens up a GraphQL playground that you can use to test your queries, or that you can use to test your API. So for example, here I'm just going to clear this playground and start to test this out. So for example, this playground helps you if you don't have another tools such as Postman to test APIs or any HTTP client to test APIs, but you can just use this. So you can just immediately just use this playground. So I have some set of queries that I prepared. I'm just going to call those. So queries. So let's look at this one, which is the mutation query. So the mutation query. So if we put this one in, let's say now mutation, create a book, one item, a title, which is that, and then author of Master Lab Systems, and then author of Master Lab Systems. Okay, let's execute this query. So as you can see folks, our book has been created successfully with an ID 1, a title, and an author. Okay, so let's create a second one now. Let's say for instance we create a book 2 with a title, let's say hexa, go now, architecture, and again author, we'll leave it fine. It's execute. Okay, same goes, created successfully folks. Let's create a third book now with this serverless. Okay, all our books have been created successfully. So now again, let's try to return those. So for example, if now I call this query, so if I call this query folks, which is the type query mutation. So now let's say instance we wanted to get the first book with an ID 1. So I execute it. There we go. Exactly folks, we're getting back our book with an ID 1. So this is like to filter by a book ID, and then if we want it now, which is book 2, if we wanted to get book 2 by an ID, let's get that. Exactly, it's being returned successfully folks, as you can see. Same if we were to do book 3. So now let's call out our third query, which should list out all our books, all our available books. So now let's do that. Then we can be setting that our API has been deployed successfully and is working successfully. So let's run that, which is a list books. Exactly folks, we are getting our data back. Those are all our 3 books that we created. Okay, so now that we are getting those folks back. So as I said earlier, if you don't want to use this AppSync GraphQL playground, you can still do the same process, because of you already have what? The key and the endpoint to the API. So you can still, let's say for instance, I want to test using the key and the endpoint. So for example, this is our endpoint. which is what I will be copying, and go to my Postman. Okay, so on Postman I have some snippets already. If I go to Postman, let's put that endpoint. Okay, I'm just gonna take this off. Let's now go to headers because we want to authenticate, of course, first. So now we go back here and call our API key. So this is our key now. Let's get this, which is the key to authenticate to this API. So let's paste it in here. Okay, so now that we've pasted in here, we should be able to send out queries. Now we have authenticated. Let's go back to our body and start to run our queries. For example, now that we've created 3 books on the AWS console on AppSync, so we need to return the same books we've created here, of course, but this time let's do it in Postman. So I have some query already for Postman that should do the same thing. Pretty much basically the same query, but of course this is syntax is pretty much cleaner for Postman. So if now I were to run the same query that goes to our API, which is on AWS AppSync, to return what? A list of books with their title, ID, and author name. Okay, so now if I execute this query, we should return the exact results we got on AWS AppSync. As you can see, folks, status code is 200, so it means our results are successful. There we go. We are getting back our books. So, folks, I think this is all we needed for this demo. As you can see, we are getting back all our books. It means our deployment was successful. So now, even if we needed to add one more functionality again, the same process will still be the same. Either you add a new resolver, and then you come in as well and add what? A definition for it, mutation definition. Then you do another deployment. So it means you have made a change again, and then you will do a build, and then from doing a build, and then you do a deployment. It should still deploy fine with your new changes, of course. So folks, I think now that you have those in here, now we can finalize our demo and maybe look at the next step. So as I said, of course, the next step might be if you want to now do a monitoring of your application, of your, or for instance, or even maybe a CI/CD pipeline. So again, you have some options to use GitHub Actions, for example, if you want something that will automate this deployment for you. But via a CI/CD pipeline, you can use AWS AppSync CTK or CloudFormation, or use GitHub Actions or with connection to code pipeline to deploy those schemas and functions automatically. Okay, so now looking at the QAs and the next step. So of course, it might be important for you to add the subscriptions for real-time updates. Use OpenSearch, of course, for production text search if you need to, and integrate with Cognito. Very important for an extended security, so you can be sure to touch into hiding auto security for your APIs. Okay, folks, I think that's all, folks, we needed. If you like this video, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and put that like. And also, if you have any comments or questions, please post them in the comment section and I will be answering those, folks. Otherwise, see you in the next tutorial. Thank you. Cheers, bye.